The trick of Pythia. Somewhere on the magical mountain of Delphi, in a crossroad that always meet two winds, where the breath of Apollo meets Pindos the Zarivori, there was once an inn that had a fortune-teller old woman, a dreamy retail scoundrel, as people said. The hikers avoided passing this path, and the horsemen passed quickly from the front without being stopped by the calls and entreaties. Her name was not uttered by anyone. You want from fear, you want from superstition. But she everywhere said that she was the famous Pythia, the mouth and voice of the god Apollo, and that her oracles reach from the innermost thoughts to the unspoken desires of mortals. No one knew how it was. Elsewhere they described her as an old toothless woman with flushed hair like a half-burned straw, and elsewhere they talked about a black-clad hunchback beggar who would return all day and until the black night on the day of the first Psycho Sabbath every year, and promised the golden oracle, the secret for riches untold, in the house that would give her a child to have for her own. The elders of the neighboring villages again insisted that this woman had gone mad for years, when even the Greeks bowed their head to the yoke of the Franks, the Venetians, and the Turks, after she had lost her child from the pestilence that had wiped out whole villages in Rumeli. Others claimed that her child had been killed by villagers and that she went mad with pain and gave birth to a curse. From that day, it would be 2 centuries now, whoever met her saw a shadow of a woman speaking within her bosom and anathematizing those who bore children. Legend or story, where the legend begins and where the legend ends, no one knew to tell. The stone chimney of the inn was always smoking, winter and summer, and it is said that some, who by cunning had gone to see and unravel the mystery, came back without speaking, and what they saw they could never either say or write. In the years that our history begins, the era of travelers from Europe who loved Greece and returned everywhere to paint and praise it in their books, the oracle Pythia was forgotten by the many people, and the smoke from the inn smokehouse, along with the monosyllable of the fatalism brought by the wind in the places under the walker, haunted the thoughts only of those who could see and hear them. The fame of her ghost passed from Rumeli to Moria, and thence to Zante and the other Ionian islands. She traveled by the mouths of my lords, counts, and nobles to the banks of Calais, and passed on to the mainland of England. Those who heard the story there showed little interest and did not attempt to learn anything more. England has always had her own legends of ghosts, more terrifying, chained shadows of nobles, knights, and curs who crawled into towers and dungeons, monsters mythical, beasts of the marshes and wilds that lurked warm flesh. Those who cared to see the world and had in their turn Greece competed to describe and highlight the ancient beauty and magnificence of Byzantium. Among them, not so famous but respected by those who knew him, there was a baronet, a single nobleman of the south, who left the land of Spain as a royal envoy with a message to the crown, and had ended up married, widowed, and unhappy for the rest of his life, thanks to an adventure that happened to him in the land of the Greeks, and that his story is found in an old manuscript and in 2 editions of popular legends of the time of 1905, which are in a museum and a tower, with their pages closed forever. I found it in the original, delivered into my hands by a London lawyer some years later. And if you are wondering, dear reader, with what emotion and for what reason I narrate it, have a little patience and read it. Bend over Don Ribeiro's story, and perhaps in the end you will understand.
My name is Don Riberio Maria Llorientes, and I am born in a small village outside the town of Bata in Granada. My parents were poor rascals of the land, living by their toil and tormented only by their folly in trusting others. Soon my father went bankrupt, and the only solution for the survival of the rest was the agreement he made with a large landowner that I and 3 of my 6 brothers work on his behalf. With my mind and honesty, I succeeded in winning my master's confidence and in entrusted me with his most serious affairs, in making treaties with merchants and usurers, in attending on his behalf to trials, to legal disputes, and to all sorts of confidential business in the great city. From there, I began to learn the world, and my counsels grew more and more numerous, until I reached the interior of the Silvela government. But all this matters little now, and how the eldest son of a ragged farmer from Granada managed to work on behalf of the Prime Minister is a matter of another narrative. My last affair in Spain involved the order I had received to convey some papers of high national importance to Queen Victoria's palace, and to mediate for an agreement the importance of which forbids me to mention it. I closed the affair in a few days, and in view of my admiration for the British Crown and my desire to know the world beyond the Pyrenees, I was permitted to remain on the island and travel there as long as I wished. Lady Cornuella and I met on the very first evening of my stay at the palace. I fell in love with her as soon as I realized she was asking to make a lie true, to build a family out of love. She fell in love with me because I was her lie that would become truth. I desired just the same as she. In my recent and relatively brief past in the environment of President Silvela, I had already refused 3 times to marry a protégé or daughter of an official. I did not wish to gratify my interests by means of a marriage, since in my 20s I had admitted the strength of my youth and rested only on it my every desire for the future. We married quickly, and in just 6 months we were waiting for the first fruit of our love. But the child was not meant to be born, and his loss plunged our home in silence and sorrow. We admitted our human inability to control God's will, we healed the pain with love for one another, and a year later a second child filled our words and thoughts with hope and joy of anticipation. But I think it would be better if it didn't show up either. What pain can be considered more unbearable than that which the death of your child brings forth? The second pregnancy lasted a month longer than the first, but not the pain that followed the miscarriage. At the end of the 3rd year, my wife was reduced to speaking to no one, except when she abused the servants of the house and sank into a stifling melancholy, from which she was drawn only by brief outbursts of hysterics and violent anger. Our visits to the best doctors in London and Paris aggravated her psychology more, and I would have been an idiot had I not regretted that I had persisted so long in getting a clear answer from everyone. Sometimes ignorance breeds bliss and luck, or at least hides from consciousness what we will never have. But I had insisted on knowing. Cornuella would never have had a child, and every effort of ours, if it had not led to the same result hitherto, would otherwise have given birth to a monstrosity or a creature with a determinate malformation. This was more or less the diagnosis of all the doctors who had examined her, and in some cases it extended to hormonal or cerebral dysfunctions, which should be taken seriously if we insisted on wanting a child born of her bowels. The steadfast refusal of all to give us even one unit of hope in the millions of this world shook my wife's faith and her health. She refused God and people, shut herself up in the depths of her soul, and mourned for the lost dreams she once had. I was now out of frame in her life. She exchanged with me only the words that the gentleness of her manners required, and spent the endless hours in her boudoir in the company of drink, silent before the window that looked at the back of the garden, cut off from the present living the end of her own world. The few times she spoke to me as a companion, she insisted that I leave her and find another one to make my life. I never condoned this fatalism, nor did I react every time he tried to persuade me to leave. I held tight to my feelings for her and saw my love triumph day by day in my heart, a victory rising through a tale of pain and suffering. I endured and longed for the miracle. So I stood by her for another 5 years. To our circle and to all connected with us, I induced her to believe in a permanent indisposition of her, a remnant of her last pregnancy, and chose to fill the long gaps of our absence from all the convenient excuse of tours in the English north and trips to the Spanish south. Living for more than 6 years now in England and with high acquaintances on the throne, I was admitted to any club I desired and was able to associate with every distinct personage of that place. London was then nourished by the moods and vigour of those returning from long journeys. You could hear everywhere, from the last tavern to the most closed company of aristocrats, stories from exotic places, others from the lips of adventurers, other narratives of travellers who lived life on the altar of knowledge. At that time, in the countries of Austrian and German influence, mainly in the middle and eastern part of Europe, new philosophies were fermenting, new crossroads were being carved, the world was trying and experimenting, setting up and demolishing temples, betting on courageous theories, abolishing others, and everyone understood that this upsurge was destined to illuminate or shade the future of people. England stood aloof from these developments. Here, too, was a breath of spirit, but apart almost selfishly from the others. The British had proved by centuries pioneers and mainstays of the Western world, and it is fated, when one stands so high, to be surrounded by solitude. That's the price of the summit. British politics and its pursuits were then concentrated in places inaccessible and controversial to most allies and competitors, and in others, contenders, that changed hands from century to century. One of these was the gates of the East, Greece. I realized the need to go outside the borders on New Year's Day 1905, when, in a burst of self-criticism, I measured my life up there and distinguished what I had achieved from what remained to do. I had a respected name in the circles of the English aristocracy, a seemingly successful marriage, and my teenage dream remained unsatisfied. I wanted to travel. Along with this emptiness, I also carried my wife's grief, which weighed on home life. The trip to Greece was decided at the next day's table, and Cornuela accepted my proposal as a New Year's gift, with enthusiasm and the wish that the tour in the land of the Greeks would stand the beginning of our new life. We agreed to start the first week in March, and with the aid of a map procured me by a good friend, we formed our program. We would take port at Action, and from there we would go to Delphi, Athens, Nafplion, Olympia, Mistra. We left the sequel and the way back blank in the list. For these we would decide there and according to our circumstances and mood. We arrived in Greece on the 23rd of March, and before we got off the ship, we had our first fight in months. During the last few days, Cornuela had been complaining of a constant indisposition, and on the last night of our journey to the Adriatic, she had had a dream, which we knew not whether to interpret as an omen of hope or a warning of danger. A black-clad old woman had appeared in her sleep, inviting her to visit her at the sanctuary of Delphi, following the road from the east. There the seed that was in her would bind and give birth to a healthy child. I refused to believe what I was hearing, and objected to her proposal that we should cross the Pindos and the Thessalian plain, which was full of robbers, on a whim of her superstition. By her entreaties and anger, she succeeded in persuading me. After 2 days in Action, we took an Italian merchant going to Piraeus. We would visit Athens first, and we might succeed in receiving a well-known French doctor who was there at the same time. I hoped his examination would vindicate me and convince her that the dream was simply the birth of her desire, since all the doctors who had examined her had ruled out a new pregnancy. Near to my hopes, I prayed that she might at last forget her sick obsession and her nerves calmed by the Mediterranean sun. I regret to confess that I fell out in both. The doctor diagnosed a pregnancy and recommended that she take the standard precautions of a pregnant woman in the first month. This overthrow led her to confide to me her secret, her constant communication with the old fortune-teller for months, through dreams and visions. I am not yet sure what I should have believed then, but her story and the warm anticipation of meeting the unknown woman made me fear that she had now lost her senses. Her laugh sounded like a little child's, unsteady and insolent, and her gaze was lost to me, flying over the earth and lost in the bright blue of the sky. In the hours when she was in earnest, her lips twitched and gave birth to an inextricable dragging of words, a secret chain that bound her to her, the unknown woman in my wife's dream. I decided not to react, remembering a psychiatrist's book about women's obsessions, which in some cases were personified through non-existent characters. Her desire to meet the old woman, whom she already adored as her goddess, did not change the schedule of the trip, since Delphi was our next stop. I welcomed in moderation, I must admit, the prospect of meeting with such a charismatic spirit, and in return I accepted her embrace and wet kisses in the shade of an olive tree of the ancient agora, a reaction reminiscent of a child's enthusiasm, since thus her last dream would come true. We would meet the oracle coming from the way of the east. We faced the mountain of god Apollo after 6 days, enchanted by the landscape and the Greek spring sunshine. The inn, which would have accommodated us, had not even the rudimentary comforts, which in any other case would have drawn a multitude of comments altogether in harmony with the manners of an English lady. Cornuela ignored the apologies and apologies of the innkeeper's wife for the non-existent level of service, and wished to know where she would find the fortune-teller. No one in the parlour seemed to know her, but her obstinacy and the pounds that flashed in her hand made the oldest of them all faint. Her name we never mention, nor has anyone seen her for years. Don't look for ghosts, my lady. His manners testified to a man who had lived in other worlds, and his English was much the same as ours. I wanted to know more about him, more to turn the conversation elsewhere, since I saw my wife ready to explode in anger. I didn't get an answer to anything I asked. The old man rose from his seat and opened the door. We heard his voice calling to us from outside. Coming out, we saw him pointing to a ridge under the top of Parnassus. In that place there lived once, 250 years ago, an old woman who was looking into the future. He had an inn whose stones stand one upon the other to this day. No one lives there anymore, and they say the place is haunted. He didn't know anything else, but even if he did, I was sure he wouldn't tell. The place he showed us was snowy, and our change was not intended for winter conditions. Cornuela paid him, and stood looking at the mountain pensively. He did not speak of the old woman for the rest of the day, and it was only when we lay down in the evening that he asked me to buy double provisions in the morning, that we might have them with us when we were going up to the Tristram at old Pythias's inn. I did not give her words the gravity they ought, and regretted it in the most cruel manner the next morning. Waking up, I saw her bed empty and her things gone. I went down like a madman into the parlour, but neither the innkeeper had seen her go. I could tell from his meaning that he must have awakened before dawn. Paying no attention to what he was trying to say to me in his poor English in his hands, I paid and went out to get my horse. He caught up with me while I was saddling it and gave me a drinking flask, showing me by gestures that I would need it for the cold. I reached the mountain trail laboriously, beaten by the frosty air and the damp breath of the earth. The drink helped me. I warmed up and found strength, and with it I found the 3-horse, a little more, driven by the tracks of animals on the snow. I followed what looked like a horse, hoping that I might catch up with her before the snow dwindled and I lost track of her horse. The tracks advanced a few yards and stopped at the edge of the path. I drew near and looked with horror under my feet. I saw the chasm of the cliff stretching away, and in the distance the little village with our inn on its edge. I could make out his chimney smoking, the smoke of it rising higher than the houses and reaching almost to my face. I could even swear I could smell it. It was an illusion that shortened the space and made the impossible seem easy, since the distance to the village was great. For this fallacy was my agitation and my fears for her, which caused me not to notice at first the stone house with the blackened chimney, which stood at the root of a rock at the beginning of the precipice, a few yards in front of me. I looked for the path that would lead me there. The mountain here descended perpendicularly, and the slope of the ground did not permit horse and rider to descend together. I tied my horse to the nearest tree and started to dismount. I reached home with much trouble, spurred more by the desire to allay my fears. If Cornuela had gone down the precipice, her horse would have been lying there, protected by his instinct. As the animal was nowhere to be seen, evidently the two of them had taken another road, which I was ignorant of for the moment. I knocked vigorously at the door and waited. I looked around and realized how far out I had fallen in my calculations. I was standing next to a 3-strath, smaller than the one I had come to, which connected a narrow path that came from the west, the one I came down from the north, and a vertical steep pass, which reached the opposite slope, passing by the village, descending to the depths of the cliff, and again climbing towards me until it was lost in the fir forest. Behind me, faded by the passage of time, stood 2 signs. One read Messalongian and pointed to the west, and the second, which looked to the south, had the ending AI left. I remembered the descriptions of travellers of the previous century. I was on the old road which connected the holy city of Messalongi with that of Athens. I shouted loudly, "Good morning," in Greek, and knocked at the door louder, looking around me. I could see no one, but I had the sense of a presence changing hiding places around me and watching me. I pushed open the door and entered. I found myself in a space that seemed to be larger than the hut on the outside looked, and resembled a slaughterhouse. In front of me was a broken-down reception bench with a wooden dresser with shelves behind it, a picture of a field of attacking barbarians. On the left I could see a small opening in the wall, a sort of crypt without its covering, and on the right a row of stone benches built in a row. I advanced towards them and discerned another line farther back. As I advanced, the dull light from the door moved with me. I could now distinguish the whole interior, many yards in front of me. There were stone benches everywhere. I counted at least 20 rows with 12 constructions each. I walked among them without destination, asking for something that would help me understand where I was. The extent of space seemed incomprehensible even in height, surpassing that of a chamois. The stone rows were crowding as I advanced, and, judging from the picture of the landscape outside the hut, I calculated that I should have reached over the precipice. I was afraid to go on and turned toward the reception bench. Behind him were steps descending to the earth. The soil there was wet and black, different from the rest of the hut. I stooped and took a little in my hand. I let it scatter like dust in the air. The smell reminded me of charcoal, and the texture pierced my hand like 1,000 little needles. The steps descended abruptly for 2 yards and led into a narrow space, a sort of cave, lighted by the flame of a candle in the distance. I walked over there and tried to see behind the pile of stones that blocked my way. Most of them were the size of a palm, and all together formed a cone not more than 1/2 meter high. My eyes had begun to get used to the light of the candle, and now I could discern some details of the place. I was in an ancient catacomb which seemed to have been opened by centuries. Its walls were rough and with an irregular surface. Elsewhere there were wedge-shaped protrusions, and elsewhere voids and pits were formed. Everywhere were signs of a man's hand, carved Delphic E, and symbols of the sun. I thought my eyes were playing games with my mind as I saw one of the stones of the pile move and lift with a whirling motion backwards. The eyes of the blue faded colour that looked at me, false as doll's glass, were expressionless and surrounded by creases. Before me was the face of an old woman, or I dare say, the face of a creature that looked human. Her expression reminded her of a mummy. She looked straight and far away, as if she would pierce me with her gaze, as if I did not exist for her. Her lips did not stand out on her wrinkle-patched face, and, however attentively I looked at her, I was not sure in what it might differ from the stones around her. Cornish's words about the dream of the Adriatic filled me with terror. If the woman opposite me, the horrible skull with the wrinkled flesh in the stones, was the one who had visited her in her dream, if this image was the prelude to our bliss, then I would swear to all the gods of heaven and all the demons of hell that bliss had now passed from the edge of prayers to the steep cliffs of the heaviest curse. I never believed in superstitions, though I must confess that there were some stories which fascinated me to hear in the London clubs. She, as if she read my thought, answered, "We don't have the same faith, honey. That's why I left you and came here." "Who are you?" I asked. "Do you not know me?" Her English was perfect, and she coloured her voice like a noble one. "This is the first time I have seen you, old woman, and I do not conceal from you that your countenance agitates me." "Who are you?" "Don't stand in sight. Listen to what I am going to tell you, and you will understand." "Your voice is an old man's voice, and so old by my faith, too. Day I have never met anyone. Listen carefully, and you will recognize me." The head moved a little forward, and he smiled. Now he was looking down and behind my feet. I turned behind me and saw on my right a stone high as a seat, with a dent as smooth as if all the people in the world had sat upon it. "Sit down and listen." I obeyed. I can tell you at once where your wife is, but you will not understand me, and your reaction may do me injustice. Let me tell you what I have to tell you, and I take an oath that by the end of my talk you and your wife will have found the truth." He closed his eyes and leaned his head back. The hum that escaped from her lips and the flutter of her eyelids betrayed her drunkenness, the bewilderment that surrounded her and caught her breath as if an ancient power had come out of her through the earth, from her. "Your name is Don Riberio Maria Llorentes. The place you come from is not your place. You were not born there. There you were sent by a man who once stood high and defined the destinies of men. You executed his will and stayed on the island on the whim of your heart. The one you loved is Cornuela. She is the eldest daughter of a nobleman, and from her father's generation you have been given a title of honor, land as far as the eye can see, and riches untold. All in her land receive thee as an equal, even though thou art the son of a husbandman who came from a more humble and divided kingdom. You and your wife love each other like baby children, innocent and not expecting any benefit from each other. That love, you know it, I think, always breeds a curse. To those who mingle and love each other painlessly and futilely, the gods lay upon them a heavier burden than others. For mortal life is not embellished by bliss, it is a steep ascent which men till death ascend, and if someone happens to climb it faster or easier, a new ascent is set for him to continue. For you, this uphill is your children. You've had 2 so far, but none of them have come to her bowels. You lost them as easily as you fell in love. Your wife lifted herself on pain of death and insisted on praying and looking for a way. There is no way to achieve the impossible in this world unless you give yourself something impossible for people. Your wife begged for it and agreed to give in return the impossible, the impossible. Listen to the raptures of ancient PYTHIA and join you in the sea that separates the light of darkness from the gold that glows in the east. Your seed worked. This child shall be born. He shall be born, live and reign. Your wife's entreaties have healed the sickness of your love, and from her bowels your son will soon emerge. A good birth. Did you say healed? What kind of love passes for sickness? Love that is born and does not dwell in the clouds of vain tyranny does not pass for the love of mortals. Neither one of you wants the other for himself. This is love, uncle, which does not and ought not to people. They don't deserve it anymore, so to speak. I'd be damned if I understood what I was hearing. The old lady's eyes seemed to have turned, and between her words she let out now and then a roar or a low murmur, which made me think that her mind was gushing and giving birth to a heap of incomprehensibilities. I should have gone away at that moment, however. Alas, what he had told me was right, and, by the gods, there was more, much worse. Don't look at me with that look, stranger, born of Andalusian gypsies and flattering Englishmen. So help me God that I swear that I know more secrets about you, unspoken and secret, and more that even the mother who sowed you does not know. Her eyes came back and looked at me. They looked human now, though they had the blaze of a young horse. The 2 signs of your birth are known by your mother, and the one who takes you in her arms. Next to your belly button is one, a finger on the skin like a burning iron. The other one is in your legs from above and where your left leg starts. It's a piece of meat like a pit, pitch black as the London sky. There's a third, a memento of a horse that was once set up by robbers. It can't be seen in the eyes, and it can't be seen in the sunlight. You got it on your head, back and low. It's a cut of a sword that has been scratched, but the edge of it hasn't found you the way it should have. That mark only your wife knows, and you know that well. In the hours when you join her, she knits her fingers in your hair, and from the sweet pain, in the moments when her flesh burns with pleasure, tightens it, and little by little hurts it. You ache like that with her, but this pain is sweeter than drunkenness, an embrace with the gods of paradise. That's how you measure it. You told her that yourself. Tell me then, in what I have hitherto told you, where I have been mistaken. I thought it would be foolish, perhaps dangerous, since I did not know what I might be hearing yet, to deny that he had fallen out into something. All that he had said was true, secrets known only by those who loved me. I decided to cajole her. I don't know whether you are the famous Pythia or her ghost, as they say, but it is my duty to confess that you are an exquisite oracle, I replied. It's all true. Her eyes glowed, and her lips were drawn to the sides. She was smiling, and she was more frightened now, so much so that I could not bear to look at her any longer. What fortune-teller do you take me for? I looked up at her. It's Cornuela, darling, your wife, he said. I opened my mouth to speak, yet no word, no cry was enough to cry out what I was living for. Terror at the sound of her familiar voice now. Do you want more proof to be convinced, honey? Do you want me to say your prayers in the old market of Athens just a few days ago, as we left the doctor? Do you want me to remind you to which stars you swore your love to me the night we stood in the garden of roses? The hours when you knelt and writhed in my chamber? It isn't you. No, it's not you. You are the demon, I whispered. He raised his head and laughed. Do you really not recognize me? One by one, the stones around her began to move, and the pile broke up. I saw 2 skeletons emerge from their midst and fly over her, as many as were left to cover her. She rose to her feet. She wore the same sea dress as yesterday, only now it was filled with dirt and stains. Her belly was bloated, a pregnant woman's belly, at the 8th or 9th month. She took 2 steps towards me, with her arms outstretched as if asking for love. Running out, the last thing I heard was her laugh, same as Cornish's, but sharper, and her voice calling me back. Little do I remember of what happened afterwards. I found my horse out of his snarl, and turned like a wind into the village with my clothes torn, covered with blood on my hands and jaw. I felt a heavy pain in the head, a burning in the fingers, yet I could not remember either where I had struck or in what manner. No one agreed to listen to me. I went to the inn, begged, tried to bribe to learn, threatened and bullied with my gun. Nobody understood. Nobody seemed to know. Everybody pretended or avoided listening to me. Even the 2 or 3 with whom I had spoken the first day now shrugged as if they did not understand a word I said. I left the village and late in the evening reached the station of the gendarmerie of the nearest town. The officer heard me, but he didn't seem to believe what I told him. On the contrary, he showed unfeigned interest when I spoke to him of the indifference of the natives. He scolded me for my audacity in agitating a village with peaceful inhabitants. By my obstinacy and by the words of 2 letters of recommendation from the Queen, I persuaded him to take an interest. It is the law of this world that all subordinates should tremble lest they should lose their allegiance and their oppressor. We reached the village the next morning. At the inn were nearly all who had seen us with Cornuella on the first day. They all stood by our insistence that we should meet the oracle PYTHIA. Some even remembered their English when they addressed me, asking me to admit that my wife was acting hysterical. The gendarme looked at me as if I were mad. "Obviously the woman fell off the cliff," he said. "We will search, but if she has fallen into the ravine, we must wait for the snow to melt to find her. Here half the place is sunless, and the snows of winter last till June." I sat in the village another 30 days and ploughed all the mountain and streams to look for her. I found no trace of her, while the old hut at Tristram was deserted and locked up. For the last 10 days I have gone up there every morning and watched for the old woman. I saw her the last day. She was the same in person, short, hunched, and carrying a parcel of wood. I came out of my hiding place and ran to her before she entered the house. I shook her and frightened her into telling me where Cornuella was. Her shouts roused the village, and soon after horsemen arrived. Among them was the old man I had met at the inn. She told me the old woman's name was Leonora, and she was a widow. He lived there over 80 years and lived on alms. People shunned and feared her, called her witch, even though she didn't know how to treat a manjuni. I looked at her belly. She was thinner than a skeleton, and her clothes would fit into them. I asked to enter the house, and she stepped aside for me to pass. The space I saw was the same as the one I had seen the first time, only now the stone benches did not increase. There were 3 rows with 5 structures each, and in front of them stood wooden stools. I was looking at an old honey that hadn't worked in years. On the left was the reception room, and beside it a staircase led to a small subterranean cellar. I went down and saw empty shelves and a mouse who stared at me for a moment before it was lost in a hole in the wall. Stones were nowhere to be found. There was only the great stone on which I had sat, painted with lime like the walls. I went upstairs bewildered, ready now to believe that I had lost my senses. I returned to England after 2 months, slimmer, tanned by the Mediterranean sun, with little money and half my things. I didn't care about anything anymore. I wasn't part of this world. All I could think about was what I'd say to her parents when I met them. I close this manuscript with the hope that anyone who reads it may be interested in the history of Cornwall and seek to know what happened in the little village of Delphi in the spring of 1899. And perhaps, if I get lucky, these words will fall into my child's grasp, if he was ever born, if he lived, and if he managed to learn to read. If all this happened, then most likely he lives in Greece. Bearing in mind the memories of my childhood and the words of my father, I am sure that he will also have the marks of his ancestors on the body, the ones I have, the ones my father and grandparents had, that finger on the belly button and the meat pit above the legs, with a public announcement in the papers, perhaps the child will be found one day. If not, what can I say? Forgive me for the incongruity of my mind with language, and keep this story like a fairy tale, a birthplace of my madness.
you suspect, dear reader, the way this story has come into my hands, you will agree, I am sure, that you have just read my personal drama. I stand now in the bedroom of my house under the citadel and look at the two birthmarks, identical in all of them with those which Don Ribeiro describes. I will not dwell on my childhood, nor on what happened to me after that. The announcement in the paper I read after 29 years of constant publications, prepaid by my father's lawyer in England, since Don Ribeiro is no longer living. He put an end to his life a few months after his return from Greece, and no one, as far as I know, cared to look what became of my mother. In order to understand what happened that morning, I will relate what I heard some peasants say one winter evening, years later, hidden behind a door. It is a fairy tale that is still told nowadays. When grown-ups want to scare their children, there was, he says, in the old days, a curse in the village from a mother who killed her child in a fight. No one in the village confessed who the murderer was, and when the affair reached the ears of the town officials, the villagers claimed that the young man had been killed by robbers from another place. His mother cursed all the houses in the village for the harm they had done her. The curse, it seems, worked, since for 2 decades no child was born in that place. Then the elders visited a witch who lived on the mountain. They called her PYTHIA, and asked her to help them. Those people were the first to start this terrible game. They stole children and kidnapped pregnant women, and when they gave birth, they threw them into the deep ravine next to the village. If someone's husband happened to be with her, they were forced to tell them secrets and secret details of their marriage. Then they poured into the drink of the man-mountain herbs, cooked with magic by the old woman in Tristrato, spells that caused hallucinations, so that the poor man lost his senses and did not know what he sees and what he hears. In the surrounding places, those of Moria and Thessaly, stories were told of couples who passed by, and the woman was lost forever, while the man returned with his brains out. No one in those years paid any attention to the delusions and narratives of legends, and the natives, in order to preserve the myth of PYTHIA, spread all that you read at the beginning of my narrative. The only thing that has never been explained is whether the couples passed that way because it was their way, or were motivated to do so by some dream or vision, which seems to have happened in my mother's case, the only unintelligible point of the story to me. I don't know if I should get angry or just cry over my parents' fate. I may return to the village with a plan to wipe it out and thus complete the curse. Maybe I'll go to foreign again. The solution must be found alone, and before my rage and thirst for justice quench. But there remains one question, which I think will live in me forever. How did my mother know about that place, and about the old woman who lived there? In what way? Why did she dream about it? How was she persuaded to follow her call? I think to these people will never be found to answer me, and I won't look for an explanation any more. I would advise you not to do so either, dear reader, for if there is an explanation, you may find it in your sleep, and if so, it will be the words of PYTHIA.